Hey guys, it's Amber from the WoW Creative team, and today I'm sharing a one-layer card with dramatic dimension. I'm going to break this down into steps so that you can see how you can create lots of layers with stencils, watercolor, graphite shading, pen and ink, Zentangle, and lastly heat embossing to create that three-dimensional texture. I have the coffee cup ring stencil from StencilGirl products, a piece of Saunders Waterford high white hot press watercolor paper, which is smooth, and my Letter Sparrow pocket palette here. I also have some pixie spray, and I'll spray the back of this stencil and then press that down onto my piece of watercolor paper. And that's cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I'm going to use a copper colored watercolor here, and I wanted to have a really pretty metallic color here. And at this point, I wasn't entirely sure what I was going to do with this card, but our theme at WoW this month is masculine cards. So I thought this metallic copper would be a really pretty start to a masculine card. Now, if you don't have a stencil like this, you can also use the bottom of a coffee cup or a teacup and dip it into the paint or into coffee or tea and press it onto the paper like a stamp and create these rings that way. I've done that before for Zentangle and it works really well. I was thinking about that as I was painting this, and so then I decided to do some Zentangle on this project. So I'm starting off with a pattern called Marasu, and basically you just start with a swirl, and I'm going to flare it out at the end there. Now I'm going to add 2 lines. They're a bit curved and they're more narrow at the top than they are at the bottom. They kind of flare out like bell bottoms. I'll go ahead and fill that in with a thicker pen. So this is a Micron Graphic 1 pen that has a larger nib, and the other pen that I'll be using is a Micron 01 pen, very fine tip. I'm going to do what we call aura, which is just to outline, leaving a space and outline those dark bands that I had drawn. This is a pattern called Enyshou, and I'll have the names of the patterns listed down below in case you're interested. And if I can find the original step outs from the original artist who created these patterns, I'll have that linked down below as well. As always, there'll be more information in the blog post, so that'll be linked down below. So basically you just want to overlap these, kind of curl them. It makes it look like they're kind of more floaty and a little more organic to them. Now I'm going to add a pattern called Caviar, which is basically you draw a circle, you leave a little highlight, and then you fill it in with dark ink, and then you'll draw another circle around it, so aura around it. And here you can see a complete one. So I drew a circle, left a highlight, filled it in, and drew another circle around it. This next pattern is one that I created myself. It's called Dionaea, which is the scientific name for carnivorous plants, which is kind of what it looked like to me. It reminded me a little bit of a Venus flytrap, like those 2 pieces could close together on an insect or a bug. So that's what I named it. I'm a certified Zentangle teacher, and I really love organic patterns the most, the ones that aren't on grid patterns and are more free-flowing. So now we'll move on to the watercolor stage. Now I know I went through the Zentangle piece quite quickly, so definitely if you're watching this on YouTube, go ahead and change your settings to slow that down, you can of course rewatch it as many times as you need to. So here I have a Wonder Forest brush, and it's a round brush that comes to a really sharp point. I prefer brushes that have a pointed tip like that because then I don't have to switch brushes. The larger size brush will allow me to have more pigment and water on my brush, but the pointed tip allows me to get into these really tight spaces. So I really do enjoy these brushes. For my Letter Sparrow paints, I'm using Mayan Turquoise right now, and then I'll also add a little bit of Mayan Royal to darken it up, and then also some Nitroso Green to have a variance in the color of the water, and I'll point that out when I add the green. But basically I'm just kind of filling in these areas. There's the Nitroso Green, and I think that just adds a beautiful variance of color, and I'm just using this straight out of the pan. If I want color that is much lighter, then you can see that I go ahead and mix that on my glass mat off to the side, and I'll use that in the upper part of the card front. So at the bottom, I wanted the water to be really quite dark and deep. And at the top, I'm gonna lighten up that color. So here you can see I'm adding some shading in between some of these coffee rings with the green shade. So here I'm putting down a light coat of the Mayan turquoise, then adding some of that nitroso green to darken up the corners, and then I'll add a little bit of that, more of that Mayan turquoise in a more saturated area. So it just adds some nice shadows to in between the rings and the nooks and crannies. So the metallic color that I used on the stencil was actually bronze, not copper. So as I'm painting this card panel, the first layer that I put down is a wet on dry technique. So the brush is wet and the paper is dry, but then as you're dropping in more color, it becomes more of a wet on wet technique. You're dropping the darker pigments into those lighter colors. Moving on to the Marasu, which kind of ends up looking like a snail or some type of shellfish, a little kind of whimsical creature going on here. My first layer of color is going to be orange ochre, and it's a pretty light earth tone color. You can see I have a little bit off to the side there where I've watered it down a bit. This little snail is going to be all about layers. So I add several different colors to this, and I start on the inner, kind of like the inner circle, and then I bring it to that outer edge, but in a lighter layer. There's less pigment in that outer edge. Now I've moved on to add some green to this, and this is Antica green. It's very earth tone. You can see the swatch of it up top where it says Letter Sparrow. It's right above the TT. It's very much it's an earth tone green, very olivey. You can see it a little bit better there above the TT there. And so I added a layer of that on that inner ring, and now I'm adding some purple to this. So I want to deepen up the shadow, and I'm adding Italian violet. So this is a warm purple. So each of these colors that I'm using on the snail are warm, but you can see how that really starts to darken things up. So I'm starting with this inner ring, and then I'll start to move the colors out and deepen up the shadows on the outer ring as well. What I want to make sure that I maintain on this snail is an intense highlight in the center of each of those swirls. Here I'm just dotting on, this is actually a mixture of the Italian violet and the Mayan turquoise that we used for the water. So I just mixed a little bit of those twos, and I'm just adding a few dots just for some texture. So here I have emerald green and also Mayan yellow. I'm just mixing those. I added a little bit of the Italian violet just to knock it back a little bit, make it a little more dull, not so bright. And I'm going to start adding this to the Enyshou, which is like the little tendrils coming out of this snail shell. I'll add some Italian violet to the center of those to add a little bit of a shadow color variance. And then I'm going to add the Mayan yellow. Now the Mayan yellow looks like a green. It's almost like a super vibrant yellow green. It is super pretty, you guys. And I don't know that you can see it very well, but it's just a gorgeous color. Well, you can see it on the swatch card right above. Super pretty. So I'll just add that for the highlights. And then I'll use those same colors. So I'm using the same colors, the Mayan yellow for the first coat on the Dionaea here. And then for the shadows, I'm going to use the emerald green. Nope, nitroso green. So the nitroso green is the same green that we used in the sea. So I like to do that a lot if I'm doing a watercolor piece. And you guys, I just watercolor cards. I'm not like a watercolor artist. I don't do like big paintings. I'm not framing anything, although I do end up framing. I'm going to frame this for my daughter. So I think that's why I ended up making this card in the first place. I didn't have a plan to do this when I first started stenciling it, but during the quarantine, we have redecorated our daughter's rooms, and one of my daughters decided on an underwater theme. So it was her birthday, actually, the day after I was painting this. So she was on my mind, and the underwater theme. So I ended up giving this to her, and we're going to frame it and hang it in her room. So I think that's looking really good. And then our watercoloring is done at this point. And we'll start adding some shading with some graphite. And I also clear heat embossed all of those little circles, and I didn't film it. I'm so sorry I didn't film that, but I will show you the embossing that I do later on. Now, I forgot to shade these little guys before I did the embossing. So I was like, well, let me try and shade right on top of the embossing. It actually held onto the graphite really well, you guys, and it doesn't rub off. So that worked out. I shaded with just a regular pencil right over that clear heat embossing. Clear heat embossing over those little black circles makes them appear much darker and then of course shiny when you turn it in the light. I definitely need some embossing and some dimension on the centerpiece here, which is the snail. So I have the Wow Mixed Media Embossing Brush here, and it's perfect to take some of the embossing gel out and put it on your glass mat. I wanted this to be kind of like a distressed appearance, and so I'm just picking it up with my finger and tapping it on. We're doing a little bit of finger painting here because I didn't want any brush strokes. I didn't want any harsh edges that you might get with like the embossing pen or with the brush. I wanted it to be really kind of distressed. Now you can see that I got more on there than what I intended. So I'm just going to take a clean, dry brush. This is one that I have reserved specifically for this purpose, and I'm just going to distress the edges even more. I'm also going to pull that embossing powder away from those shaded areas. You know, I spent a lot of time watercoloring and adding that depth and the layers of watercolor to the shaded areas on the snail, so I want to make sure that that doesn't get covered up by the embossing powder. Now I'm going to knock that off into my trash because that embossing powder already is mixed with gel. I don't want to put that back into my container. So I'll knock that off into the trash, and then I'll go ahead and heat set this. I'm using the white pearl embossing powder, which is going to have a little bit of a sheen, but not over the top. And it's also going to have that white milky appearance so that it'll cast this highlight onto the center of the snail there. And look how gorgeous that is, you guys. It adds like kind of like just a really nice distressed texture. I just love so much how this turned out. I think it was the perfect powder, and I was so glad I thought to apply it in this way. It was right about at this point that one of my daughters walked over and was like, wow, that is magnificent. Which is always nice, you know, because sometimes you show your family members cards and they're like, yeah, that's a nice card, or, you know, there's very little response. So it is always exciting to get a response. So here I'm just deepening up the shadows with a little bit of graphite. I wanted to pop the snail forward a little bit more, but I wanted to make sure that I didn't cover up, again, all of the watercolor work that I put in. I wanted those colors to shine through, so I'm just adding just a little bit, enough to add that extra layer, extra bit of oomph, and to bring that forward. I also have a tortillon here, so that's just a pointed piece of paper. It's rolled up paper that comes to a point, and that helps to soften the blending. It helps to blend out the graphite and tease that out into the paper. Here's the finished card. You certainly could add embellishments, but as I said, I'm going to frame it for my daughter, and I did end up giving it to her the next day. She absolutely loved it. I hope you guys enjoyed this project. I know that it's very different from what I normally bring to the table on the WOW channel, but you can apply these same techniques to your stamped images also. So the depth that you can add with your watercolor, with that extra little bit of graphite to intensify the shading, and of course your heat embossing. I'd love to know what you think down below, so give me a shout out and I will be back soon with more inspiration. Thanks so much for joining me today. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, liking, and ringing that bell so you don't miss any new inspiration. Here's a couple more videos for you before you leave, and I'll see you real soon.